Even after more than a century since the most tragic maritime disaster in history, the Titanic continues to astonish the world. This time, groundbreaking discoveries at a depth of 3,800 meters beneath the Atlantic Ocean have shaken the global research community. Never before seen images and data, captured using the most advanced technology, not only recreate the fateful moment of the ship's sinking, but also raise a crucial question. Do we truly understand what happened that night? Long-standing theories are now being challenged by newly uncovered evidence. Every piece of wreckage, every trace of corrosion, even the way the hull lies on the ocean floor, each carries untold stories waiting to be revealed. If you're someone who craves the truth hidden behind the curtain of history, if you believe the Titanic still has something to say to us, then subscribe to our channel today. This journey will unlock a completely new perspective, and it's one you won't want to miss. Brought Titanic's ghosts back to life. For decades, the Titanic's story seemed complete. From documentaries to museum tours, every detail was poured over at least. So we thought it up. All the while, the real evidence sat in darkness nearly 4,000 meters below, unseen, untouchable, and out of reach for even the bravest explorers. In 2020, that all changed. Not because someone dived deeper, but because someone finally saw the wreck with new eyes. A digital eye set powered by photogrammetry and relentless curiosity. The mission began as a partnership between deep-sea engineering firms, National Geographic, and Atlantic Productions. Their goal was audacious map the entire wreck, every rivet and shadow, not just for show, but to answer the mysteries that generations of divers and dreamers had only guessed at. They deployed a small fleet of robotic submersibles, each loaded with multispectral cameras, lasers, and 3D mapping software. The submersibles crisscrossed the site in a methodical grid for weeks, taking over 700,000 photos from every possible angle and collecting 16 terabytes of visual data. This was not just a scan. It was, in the words of one engineer, a resurrection, a way to time travel back to the very night the Titanic vanished. As the first renderings came to light, even the most hardened experts were stunned. The bow, still stately and upright, pointed toward the New York it never reached. Railings bent, portholes gaping, and anchor chains coiled as if waiting for orders. But travel just 600 meters, and you meet the stern, a mangled skeleton, collapsed decks, boilers, and engines torn out and flung across the ocean floor. Between the two, a narrow corridor of 5,000 artifacts formed an unmistakable debris trail, like breadcrumbs marking Titanic's final agony. What makes this so powerful? For the first time, you can zoom in on a rivet, see a child's shoe, or read the faded logo on a tea set. More than that, you can trace exactly where each piece landed, giving experts a forensic timeline of the disaster in ways never before possible. The digital model, so precise that you can count the teeth on a gear or spot a scorch mark on wiring, instantly debunks some of the old myths. One of the biggest revelations the ship's breakup was not the dramatic, 1-second snap shown in movies. The scan shows a brutal, drawn-out sequence, steel beams twisting, decks folding in on themselves. Machinery hurled hundreds of meters as the stern rotated violently during descent. The bow, by contrast, buried itself gracefully in the mud, as if still reaching for the surface. This explained why the two halves looked so different, and why personal belongings from the grandest staterooms ended up in the same resting place as a coal trimmer's shovel. With each pass of the submersibles, new details came into focus. There were rooms never seen by cameras before, corridors where melted wiring still clung to the walls, and collapsed bunks with luggage tangled in a net of debris. The precision of this technology allowed researchers to reconstruct where crew and passengers must have stood, what they clung to in their final moments, and how quickly the chaos unfolded. But as extraordinary as these visual discoveries are, they lead to even bigger questions. If the outside of Titanic told a new story, what would a closer look inside remember, especially in the engine rooms and electrical systems? reveal about the ship's last stand was the story of heroism and tragedy even more complex than we realized. With one final sweep of the submersibles, the focus shifted from the ghostly corridors to the real battlefield of Titanic's last hours, the engine room and the brave crew who fought to keep hope alive long after others had given up. If you thought the surface was shocking, wait until you see what the digital scan exposed deep below decks. Just as researchers thought they had seen everything, what happened in the engine rooms changed the fate of everyone on board. And finally, wow, the evidence has surfaced. Titanic's final battle below deck. In every retelling of the Titanic's tragic story, the focus has always been above decks. We picture frantic passengers dashing for lifeboats, the band bravely playing as the Atlantic claims the ship, and officers trying to maintain order as chaos builds all around. But what really happened deep below, in the belly of the ship where the heartbeat of the Titanic pulsed with fire and steam, until recently, much of that story was left to speculation and the occasional footnote. Now, with the advent of groundbreaking three-dimensional scanning technology, those shadows have lifted, and what has emerged is a story of almost unimaginable grit and sacrifice. The Titanic was not just a luxury liner. It was a floating power plant, driven by 29 boilers, over 150 furnaces, and some of the largest reciprocating steam engines ever built at the time. The engineering spaces were sprawling, labyrinthine, and dangerous even in calm waters, let alone as water began to pour in through the hull. For the stokers, trimmers, and engineers working below, life was already a punishing cycle of sweat and exhaustion. They worked 12-hour shifts, surrounded by heat that could blister skin and noise so intense it rattled bones. Yet, in those last hours, they faced a challenge that no training could have prepared them for. The new scan, compiled from over 700,000 high-resolution images, brought the lower decks into focus with an intimacy that would have been unimaginable even a decade ago. Forensic investigators found the metal grates in boiler room number 2 buckled inward, evidence that the heat and pressure did not drop, even as water breached the compartment. The only way this could have happened, experts say, is if the men on duty continued to stoke the fires and tend the boilers long after others had fled to higher decks. These men were the keepers of Titanic's life force, and their refusal to abandon their posts gave hundreds of people above them a fighting chance to survive. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Every extra minute the lights stayed on, every moment the pumps continued fighting the relentless flow of icy Atlantic water, meant another lifeboat could be launched. Another child could be handed to safety. Another group of desperate passengers could make their way through the labyrinthine corridors to hope. Without those men, names now partially recovered through ship rosters and survivor tributes, much of the order on Titanic's decks would have collapsed into blind panic. One survivor, Lawrence Beasley, later wrote, "The lights, steady and reassuring, gave us courage. Only later did I realize that someone had to pay for that calm with their lives." The details emerging from the scan paint an almost cinematic portrait of the ship's last hour. The mangled stern section yielded a clue no previous expedition had ever spotted: a manual steam valve, locked in the open position, hidden among twisted pipes and collapsed walkways. In maritime engineering, that valve was a lifeline feeding steam from the boilers to the ship's dynamos, which powered the electrical system. Survivor after survivor remembered the electric bulbs burning against the black night, flickering but refusing to go out until the very end. In the past, skeptics dismissed this as poetic exaggeration. Now, metallurgical analysis shows it is the literal truth. The men in the engine rooms made a conscious choice to keep the generators running as long as possible, buying time not for themselves, but for strangers they would never meet. Forensic electrical engineers, poring over the three-dimensional model, found something else chilling: scorched wiring and corroded junction boxes near the forward power station. Unlike random fire damage, these marks showed a pattern of overload. The engineers had deliberately rerouted current through backup circuits, keeping the ship's power grid alive as long as they could. Some of these wires were fused by heat, evidence that someone took the time, even as water rose to their knees, to maintain the delicate balance of power and light. If the men had abandoned their posts even 15 minutes earlier, Titanic's decks would have been plunged into pitch-black chaos. This painstaking, quiet heroism stands in contrast to the panic and confusion above. Historians, revisiting the official British and American inquiries into the disaster, have found survivor testimony that now makes more sense. Women and children, rushing to lifeboats, recalled that the ship felt alive, even as it was dying. Many assumed that was just the memory of terror, but now it's clear the sense of order, the last calm, was bought by the engineers, firemen, and trimmers who stayed behind, knowing there was no way out. Their names were seldom mentioned in the headlines, their stories often buried beneath tales of aristocrats and millionaires. But the 25 scan is changing that narrative forever. Digging deeper into these spaces, investigators pieced together the timeline. The iceberg strike had torn open 6 of Titanic's watertight compartments, a fatal number that doomed the ship. Yet, with each passing minute, the crew below struggled against the inevitable. The boiler rooms were quickly overwhelmed by the rising sea. In the oppressive heat and steam, men fought to shovel coal, redirect pressure, and run pumps even as freezing water bit at their ankles. The manual override on the steam valve was not an accident, it was a calculated act, perhaps performed by the chief engineer himself or a trusted assistant, sealing the fates of those below for the slim hope of saving those above. Stories collected from surviving and crew paint an even more vivid picture. Trimmer Walter Hurst, one of the few engine crew to make it out, described the chaos in those final minutes. Water was coming in fast. The sound was like thunder, and all around men were shouting, trying to be heard over the roar. But the engineers, they were calm. They just kept working. I don't know how they did it, but the lights stayed on. It was like they were fighting the night itself. Hurst's account matches perfectly with the new evidence. The engineering crew's professionalism and sacrifice made all the difference between life and death for hundreds on deck. The emotional impact of these discoveries is profound. For more than a century, the story of Titanic was a tragedy dominated by loss and questions: why were there not enough lifeboats? Why did the ship sail so fast? Why did help come too late? The digital scan, in its silent clarity, answers a different question: who stood their ground when hope was gone? Who turned a technical disaster into an act of defiant humanity? The images of warped grates, scorched wires, and a single open valve tell a story that words never fully could. In the frozen metal of Titanic's grave, the unsung heroes finally get their due. Maritime safety expert Dr. Elaine Barnes, one of the consultants brought in to interpret the scan, summed it up best in her report. Titanic's true legacy is not just in how she was lost, but in the men who bought time with their lives. It is not enough to say they were brave. They were the line between survival and oblivion. The evidence backs her claim. 30 or more men remained below decks to fight a losing battle against the sea. They delayed the inevitable, and in doing so, changed the outcome for hundreds of souls. But the new technology has not only vindicated the forgotten heroes, it has also exposed just how close Titanic came to a different ending. Engineers have calculated that, had the generators failed even 10 minutes earlier, chaos would have reigned above deck. There would have been no light for the evacuation, no power for the pumps, no chance for officers to maintain order. The margin for the survival was measured in millimeters of steel, in the position of a valve, in the last flicker of electricity, tiny variables, each weighted with life or death. This revelation casts a new light on the aftermath. When Titanic's bow finally dipped beneath the waves, the stern section rose high, illuminated until almost the last moment. Witnesses in lifeboats described a strange golden glow from the windows, a surreal beacon against the night. For decades, that image lingered as myth. Now it is fact. The last stand of Titanic's engine crew is etched into the very architecture of the wreck, preserved not just in legend, but in metal and wire. As researchers followed the forensic trail through twisted corridors and scorched panels, they realized the real story of Titanic was not about failure, but about endurance. The scan has given us a new way to read the final hours, a chronicle of choice, sacrifice, and the highest form of courage. If ever there was a question about whether heroism could exist in darkness, Titanic's unsung engineers have given us the answer, written in rivets and iron. Yet even as the world digests these revelations, the scan points to new mysteries. Why? With all this courage and skill, did the ship fail so completely? What role did design and construction play? Was Titanic doomed by fate or by flaws that no one saw coming? The next chapter turns from the human story to the mechanical, a forensic autopsy of the ship itself, as scientists use the scan to simulate the breakup and analyze the tiniest margins that separated survival from disaster. The story only gets more astonishing. As the lights flickered and the final pumps sputtered out their last gasp, did the very bones of Titanic doom her before she even set sail? The answer lies in the twisting metal and shattered decks, where fate, engineering, and human resolve met in the coldest hours of history. What happened next would not only shock survivors, but force the world to rethink everything it knew about the greatest shipwreck of all time. Anatomy of a catastrophe. How Titanic really broke apart. And as Titanic's engineers made their last stand below deck, a different kind of battle was playing out above the relentless physics of cold iron, rising water, and Ross Atlantic force. For a century, artists and filmmakers have tried to capture that awful moment when the ship split in two. We have all seen the dramatic images, the bow plunging, the stern rearing skyward, people clinging to railings as the world's greatest liner vanishes beneath black water. But what did the new scan actually reveal for the first time? It gives us a frame-by-frame, forensic replay of the ship's destruction, one that upends decades of speculation. It all begins with what the scan calls the paper-thin catastrophe. For years, it was thought the iceberg gouged a massive hole in Titanic's hull, but the truth is almost more chilling. The three-dimensional model lays out the damage with scientific precision, 6 long, razor-thin slits, some no wider than a few millimeters, stretching along nearly 300 feet of the starboard side. Imagine a series of surgical cuts running parallel to the waterline, each just enough to let the North Atlantic seep in, one compartment at a time. This is not a story of a single catastrophic breach, but of death by 1,000 cuts. A ship that bled out in slow motion while everyone above tried to escape the inevitable. The scan lets us see what water did to steel. As compartments flooded, Titanic's bow settled deeper, pulling the stern upward at a sharper and sharper angle. Structural engineers, running simulations based on the exact digital measurements, describe the hull's agony as a perfect storm of stresses, the immense weight of the forward compartments, the buoyancy of the stern, and the rising water's pitiless climb over each watertight bulkhead. The ship was designed to survive 4 flooded compartments. The iceberg compromises 6. That razor-thin margin made all the difference. Now, picture what this actually looked and sounded like. Survivors in the last lifeboats spoke of a sound like nothing they had ever heard. A great, groaning roar, like 1,000 freight trains, as one described it. They were hearing the ship's central spine snap, a sequence that the scan shows was neither quick nor clean. Instead, the three-dimensional model reveals a slow, violent unraveling. The bow dragged downward. The stern twisted and stretched. And then, in a matter of seconds that felt like eternity, the entire structure failed. At the very core of the wreck, investigators traced a pattern of torsional stress, a spiral of metal fatigue that coiled up through the ship's backbone. Deck by deck, the scan documents the sequence beams warping, deck plates folding like origami, bulkheads buckling under loads they were never meant to bear. In some places, the hull was ripped apart so violently that pieces of steel were curled back on themselves like paper scorched in a fire. The wreck site preserves this moment perfectly. The bow, upright and mournful, is embedded deep in the silt, almost a full deck's height below the seafloor, as if the ship tried to keep going long after she should have stopped. The stern, in contrast, is a mangled, collapsed heap, its decks pancaked into a jumbled ruin that still seems to radiate energy. The scan does not just tell a story of destruction, but of timing. By analyzing the position of debris, coal bins, bathtubs, staircase railings, even personal luggage, marine archaeologists can now reconstruct the path of the breakup. As the stern twisted free, entire sections of the midship collapsed in on themselves, trapping everything and everyone still inside. The collapse was so powerful that it vaporized parts of the central structure, scattering fragments over a debris field nearly 600 meters wide. Forensic experts describe it as a mechanical autopsy. Every torn panel, every twisted beam, a clue in a timeline of disaster. This is where the human story returns, even in the silence of the deep. Within the wreck, researchers spotted traces of the people who fought and perished in those final seconds. A collapsed bunk room, with metal bed frames still tangled together, hints at crew members unable or unwilling to leave their posts. The remnants of a staircase, twisted and fallen mid-collapse, suggest the very moment when structure failed and hope vanished. Survivor accounts of lights flickering as the ship broke are now matched by forensic evidence burn marks, fused copper, and arcing scars across junction boxes frozen at their last reading. Yet even in ruin, the scan exposes a series of near miracles. The bow's relative intactness suggests that, despite catastrophic flooding, the ship's designers had achieved something remarkable. The hull stayed together far longer than logic might predict. The very strength that made Titanic unsinkable in marketing terms was also what delayed the inevitable, allowing for the evacuation of more lifeboats. It was only when the rising angle of the stern reached a tipping point, some estimates put it at over 30 degrees, that the forces became too great and the final break began. One of the scan's most haunting revelations is the rotation of the stern. As the bow plunged, air pockets trapped in the aft compartments turned the stern into a spinning, collapsing shell. The stern did not simply fall, it twisted, turned, and then crashed down with devastating velocity, flattening everything inside. Debris from this collapse was hurled outward, creating a debris corridor that is now mapped in detail for the first time. Among the detritus, shattered lifeboats, a single deck chair wedged in a collapsed gangway, even the battered remains of the Marconi room, where Titanic's distress calls were sent in her final moments. Marine forensic expert Dr. Emily Kenson, who led part of the 2025 scan analysis, described it with a kind of awe. This was not a single clean break. It was a sequence, each failure leading to the next. A domino effect of engineering pushed to the edge. You can trace the moment of collapse, not just in metal, but in the way belongings, machinery, and even human remains were scattered. Kenson's team identified the locations where collapse was most intense, places that may one day answer lingering questions about Titanic's construction and ultimate fate. But what does all this mean for the broader history of Titanic? For one, it vindicates a handful of survivor accounts that had long been dismissed as exaggeration or confusion. Several lifeboat witnesses swore they saw the ship break apart before sinking, a claim experts debated for decades. The three-dimensional model confirms that this is exactly what happened. The split was gradual, uneven, and visually dramatic. The stern's final descent was a whirl of metal and case, a fitting end to a disaster built on 1,000 small decisions, both heroic and tragic. And yet, with every revelation, new mysteries surface. Where, for example, are the missing pieces of Titanic's midsection? The scan found empty pockets in the debris field, places where critical parts of the ship simply vanished. Some experts believe these sections disintegrated under pressure. Others suspect they are buried so deeply in sediment that they remain invisible. Even now, these questions are not just technical, they matter because each missing piece could reveal more about why Titanic failed. and how future disasters can be prevented. What about the myth of the ship's unsinkable design? The three-dimensional scan offers a sobering lesson. Titanic's double-bottom and watertight compartments, innovations for their time, may have actually contributed to the manner of her destruction. Instead of sinking as a single unit, the ship's structure transferred stress in ways no one predicted, creating the conditions for a slow, violent break. In the end, the safety features designed to save the ship may have accelerated her demise, a tragic irony written in every curled beam and ruptured seam. The human stories do not end here. Every artifact mapped in the digital reconstruction, a lost shoe, a broken teacup, a folded coat serves as a reminder of the lives interrupted by disaster. One researcher, holding a scan of a child's toy found amid the wreckage, put it plainly, Titanic is not just a cautionary tale about technology. It is a memorial to everyone who trusted, worked, or dreamed aboard her. The wreck's very layout now reads as a history lesson in risk, ambition, and the high price of hubris. And if you thought the final moments of Titanic were dramatic, what lies beneath the mud and rust may still hold the greatest revelations. With every new pass of sonar and every pixel added to the digital model, investigators get closer to solving the last mysteries. Could the missing engine parts and vanished compartments answer the century-old question, was Titanic doomed from the start? Or was she undone by a perfect storm of human error and natural force? The search for answers is not over. Let's step even deeper into the heart of the wreck and the secrets encoded in its twisted steel. Voices from the deep, Titanic's final messages and unfinished story. As the digital scans swept over Titanic's remains, what it revealed went beyond twisted steel. Each new discovery felt like a whisper from the past, a secret the Atlantic had hidden for more than 100 years. Suddenly, Panamo, it was not just about the ship's collapse. The scan illuminated the final moments, the decisions, and the courage of those trapped below. In the reconstructed Marconi radio room, forensic teams could pinpoint the path of Titanic's final SOS calls. Even after water flooded the lower decks, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent out messages for help until the ship's power finally died. Their last signals grew fainter with every minute. Matching what the digital model revealed, burnt relay boxes, fried fuses, and a tangle of silent, salt-stained cables. History was no longer a matter of guesswork. The evidence was right there in the steel. But it was not just the technology or the engineers who left their mark. The scan uncovered a battered metal locker near the officers' quarters. Inside was a tin containing a single, fragile scrap of paper. Researchers believe it is a log entry, hastily scribbled as the ship listed, noting that lights were dim, the bow was gone, and men were still at their posts. Even in the last moments, the crew chose duty over escape. The scan could even pick up the mark of the writer's pencil, making it feel as if you were standing right there with them as history turned on its head. There was more to be found than just tragedy. Among the artifacts cataloged by the scan were boots wedged in ladders, a pocket watch frozen at the moment the stern plunged, and entire trunks of first-class luggage. Inside, they found jewelry, toys, and even an unmailed postcard, all preserved by the cold. These details remind us that Titanic was more than a legend. It was a collection of lives, dreams, and last words scattered across the seabed. Not every mystery was answered, but many myths were finally put to rest. There was no sign of sabotage or hidden cargo, only the clear marks of mechanical failure in nature's power. The story was not just about how the ship died, but about how its people on board fought to keep hope alive, even as their world fell apart. The digital scan has changed our understanding of Titanic forever. Each pass of the scanner brings new clues and, with them, new questions. As researchers continue to explore, they know there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, stories of hope, sacrifice, and loss that are not yet finished. The ocean has not given up everything, and maybe it never will. More than a century has passed since the Titanic sank to the bottom of the ocean, yet the strange allure of this doomed ship has never faded. To me, the Titanic is not just a maritime tragedy, but a profound symbol of human fragility in the face of nature, of pride humbled by fate, and of mysteries that have never been fully unraveled. Beneath 800 meters of icy water, in a place untouched by light, the ship rests as a haunting reminder of the things we thought we knew. In truth, so much remains untold. What keeps drawing me back to the Titanic is not merely its scale or luxury, but the quiet, unanswered questions it left behind. How could a ship once deemed unsinkable collapse on its maiden voyage? Was it all truly an accident, or is something still being hidden? The fatal decisions, the ignored warnings, and the forgotten souls at the ocean's floor all weave together a shroud of secrecy that only grows more chilling the deeper we search. The Titanic is a ghost of the past, yet also a mirror reflecting the present and the future. If you too are captivated by unanswered mysteries and driven by the desire to uncover what lies beyond the spotlight, subscribe to our channel and join us on this journey to explore the dark corners beneath the ocean's surface, where history still whispers.